It's our pleasure to host Professor Ilan Pappe, the director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter, and the fifth lecture of the called Politics During the Corona in Mada al-Carmel. It's not accidentally that we are hosting Professor Ilan Pappe at the week that we are commemorating the Nakba. Professor Ilan Pappe is a very well-known figure, academic and political figure who wrote a lot about the Palestinian history and about the history of the Palestinians and Palestine, and also about the history of the Zionism. He also wrote a very famous and well-known and important book about the Nakba. However, he didn't call it Nakba, he called it, and he preferred to call it Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He also wrote a book about the Palestinians in Israel called The Forgotten Palestinians, a subject that Mada al-Carmel is very engaged in as a research center. Again, we are very happy to have Professor Ilan Pappe. He will give a talk about the deal of the century in the post-colonial time era. We're honored to have you. تفضل أستاذ.
It's a great pleasure to participate in Mada Carmel's series of lectures, Politics in the Time of the Corona. My name, as was mentioned, is Ilan Pappe, and it's a great honor to be part of this program. The topic I chose to talk about is the American deal of the century and its implication for the future of Palestine in what can be called the post-Coronial period. My talk will be divided into three parts. I will first talk about the American policy up to the deal of the century. Then I will describe what I believe are the motivations behind that deal, both the motivations of the American administration, but also their Israeli partners, namely the various Netanyahu governments. And finally, I will try and assess what the future holds for us in terms of the impact of this American-Israeli initiative on the life of people in historical Palestine. American policy up to the deal of the century, and it doesn't matter of which administration we're talking about, was based on an understanding that there is a difference between declarations, symbolic acts on the one hand, and proper actions on the ground on the other. Thus, for instance, whereas the official declared policy of the United States was not to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, not to recognize the Jewish settlements in the West Bank and before that in the Gaza Strip as legitimate, on the ground, these declarations or these declared position had very little influence, as America did not take any action to stop the Israeli policies in the West Bank or elsewhere in historical Palestine. But it seemed for American policymakers that this was the golden mean between an unconditional support for Israel on the one hand and interests in the American interest in the Arab world and beyond on the other. Americans would say that the American administration, when it came to criticizing Israeli unilateral actions on the ground, especially in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, were talking the talk but not walking the walk. And this seemed to satisfy their partners in the EU and the various allies that the United States has in the Arab world. It also fitted very much the kind of position what could be called liberal Zionists in Israel were holding for many, many years, where the rhetoric about peace, reconciliation, did not have to match the actions on the ground, which in most cases were against peace and reconciliation. So what really changed in the deal of the century was that there was for the first time a clear American admission that the United States never had and never intended to play the role of an honest broker between Israel and the Palestinians. I want to stress again, America was never an honest broker between Israel and the Palestinians, but there was a certain rhetoric, there was a certain American discourse that used to give the impression that America is trying to mediate between the sides, to balance the positions of the two sides, but of course in practice this was not the case. What was so clear about the Trump deal of the century, and even before, since he came to power in 2016, was that there was a sense that Washington does not feel the need anymore to play the game and can directly declare its real intentions and its real unconditional support for unilateral Israeli actions on the ground. The American deal of the century has to be seen within a wider context of American actions that preceded the the deal of the century. The transition of the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, recognizing the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, and recognizing the legitimacy of the big settlement blocks, the Jewish settlement blocks in the West Bank. So this was a package deal of American actions and declarations that narrowed the gap between America really does and what America claims it is doing. Now, what is the motivation behind these actions and why it is significant, despite the fact, as I noted several times already in this talk, there is no significant change in actual American policy on the ground. The significance is, first and foremost, that there is a new motivation here among the American policymakers that are behind the Trump administration, which is a bit new compared to, or their motivation is a new one compared to what motivated American policymakers in the past when they dealt with the Palestine question. And this time the motivation is to depoliticize the Palestine question. This was very clear if you look at the very long speech and even longer program that Jared Kushner brought with him to Manama in Bahrain when he presented at least sections of the deal of the century to American allies in the Arab world. The idea of depoliticizing the Palestine question is that if you turn the Palestinian problem into a humanitarian and economic problem, then you can solve it by humanitarian and economic means. Depoliticizing the Palestinians meant that you don't have to include in any deal the political rights of the Palestinians, whether these are the rights of self-determination, the right for independence, the right for freedom, and of course the Palestinian refugees' right of return. If you depoliticize the question, this is the hope of the people who are behind this vision, then you can hope that the Palestinian issue as a political issue with time would totally disappear and would not be anymore on the agenda. And it is the kind of vision for the Americans that is shared by some of the Arab rulers, like the rulers of Saudi Arabia, for instance, that if you can remove the Palestine issue from any regional agenda, from any as an item from any bilateral relationship the Arab states like Saudi Arabia would have with the United States and the West, it would be much easier to attend to what they would regard as far more important issues, that is the regimes. For example, for Saudi Arabia, the confrontation with Iran seems to be far more important than any solution for the Palestine question. American economic interests believe that if you remove the Palestine issue from the agenda, you can have a much easier ride in establishing economic relationship with Arab companies in the region. Now, this idea of depoliticizing the Palestine question should be seen also in conjunction with the vision and strategy of the current Israeli administration, if one could call it this way. By the current Israeli administration, I mean the Netanyahu governments since the second Netanyahu government, since 2009. We are now closing 11 years of a Netanyahu era, which has its own impact on the reality on the ground and fits very well with these ideas that were emerging after Trump came to power in 2016. The Netanyahu strategy, and this is not just his personal strategy, this is a strategy that is being built by people around him, from the security service, from the army, from the academia. A lot of people in Israeli academia are involved in this strategy, is also aiming at depoliticizing the Palestinian question. Netanyahu was the father, so to speak, of the idea of the economic peace. Already back in the mid-1990s, he was talking about economic peace. And again, the logic of the economic peace is very much the logic of the deal of the century. That is, there is an economic issue, which is the standard of living of the Palestinians, their living conditions, and there is an economic solution. You can go to the rich Arab states, recruit money, they can invest in the West Bank, they can invest in the Gaza Strip. In return, the Palestinians depoliticize everything that they are doing. There is no collective national Palestinian movement, and therefore there are no collective national Palestinian demands from the Israelis or from the world. There are several ways in which the Netanyahu strategy differs from the Trump strategy, but this difference only means that it complements what the Americans are doing. It doesn't contradict what the Americans are doing. I'll give a few examples. One is the unilateral and incremental annexation of Area C to Israel. Area C is 60% of the West Bank, and already in the 1990s, in the first Netanyahu government, but even more so since 2009, Israel is using a matrix of policies to cleanse certain areas within Area C. The tactics are the same, whether they are being executed in the Jordan Valley or in south of Mount Hebron, an area which in Arabic is called Masa Firyata. They're a combination of harassment by the settlements, declaring of vast areas as military training areas, or declaring areas as green areas, are all fused together in order to force the people who live there, people who live there outside of these places. Academics who work with the Israeli government help them by claiming that they call them Bedouins, which of course is not the right way to refer to them, but they call them Bedouins in order to give the impression that these are semi-nomadic people. So there is no transfer here, there's no ethnic cleansing, this is just a movement of people who anyway move around, which is nonsense, of course, but unfortunately has helped to silence criticism in some places in the world. Now, so this is one part of the Israeli way of depoliticizing the Palestinians, is to downsize the area in which, according to the Oslo Accord, a Palestinian national entity could at all be established, which is now only on Area A and B in the West Bank, 40% of the West Bank, as Israel does not recognize and succeeded in convincing a lot of governments in the world not to recognize the Gaza Strip as a Palestinian area, but only calls it the area controlled by the Hamas, which they don't recognize as a legitimate political body. Now, to this we should add several other Israeli actions. One infamous one, is the Israeli nationality law that was passed in the summer of 2018. This law, if you read it very carefully and you know how to connect the various clauses in that law, is another text that depoliticizes the Palestinian issue. It claims that in what one can call historical Palestine, only one group of people are entitled to express the rightful national self-determination. There's only one nation in historical Palestine, and that nation is the Jewish nation. Anyone who is not a Jew is demoted to people who, either to people who speak Arabic, or the people who speak the Arabic language, which are Israeli citizens who speak Arabic language but don't have the right for national self-determination, or the people who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which are citizenless citizens pending a solution which, according to that law, would not happen unless Israel has completed its planning for colonization, or what they would call settlement, Jewish settlement, all over the historical land of Israel as they see it. So the nationality law, which many people rightly in the world compare to the South African apartheid law of 1948, should not be seen by itself, but should be seen as part of this joint American-Israeli assertion that you can really, in the 21st century, just wipe out the Palestinian issue as a political issue and focus on Palestinians as individuals or as people who suffer from an economic or humanitarian issue, and by that removing the Palestine issue that is troubling so many Israeli and American policymakers, and they believe that it hinders them from promoting their interests in the area. And other Israeli actions, even before the nationality law, began already in 2001, even before the Netanyahu era. There was I don't know if many people remember this, but in 2001 the Israeli Knesset passed a law that prevented any future Israeli government from accepting the right of return. This was built into the Israeli law books. And more important, under the Netanyahu era, the Nakba law of 2010 that actually imposes sanctions and even worse kind of penalties of any official body that commemorates the events of 1948 as a catastrophe or as a Nakba. Recently, or not so recently, parallel to these actions, Israel has already closed the documents in the Israeli archives that pertain to what happened in 1948. There was a very telling interview with the people that the Israeli government appointed to do this job of closing the archives. And the guy who's responsible for this action, he explained very openly and candidly why the closure of the documents of what happened in 1948 is so important for Israel. And Yechiel Chorev, that's the guy's name, he said, well, and it sounds stupid, but it's worth listening to. He said, if I close the documents of what happened in 1948, all the works that are called so-called the new history, or any works of academic value that accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing or of committing war crimes in 1948, would be invalidated because people would not be able to produce the authentic documentation for their accusation, which is, of course, shows you that he doesn't understand how academic work is working. You don't need to produce the authentic documentation. You can produce a scanned document, you can produce a photocopy of a document, but somehow this is how they believe that they can somehow undermine the validity of so many academic works that since the late 1980s have proven that the Israeli version of what happened in 1948 is sheer propaganda and based on lies, and what the Palestinians have claimed for many, many years of what happened in 48 is valid and is validated again once people use the Israeli archives. Very interesting is also a second comment of his, that the constant engagement of scholars with 1948 has brought to the attention of the Palestinians and Israel again what happened in 1948, and it undermines the relationship between the Palestinian minority in Israel and the State of Israel. Again, this is a totally false idea, because the Palestinians in Israel are engaged with the Nakba not because of the Israeli documents in the archives. They have hundreds and one reasons to be engaged with the Nakba. None of them is connected to the fact whether the Israeli archives are open and not open. But what is more important here is that this attack on the archives is part of this wider vision, the vision of depoliticizing the Palestine question. To sum up this part, I would say that in many ways, the deal of the century, or what I would call the steal of the century, is an American-Israeli initiative which should be regarded as an assault on the Palestinians. It is not the same assault as the one that happened in 1948. It's not a physical assault, or it's not the same assault like Israel has executed throughout the years. But it is an assault. It is an attempt to create, if you want, another Nakba, this time through the wiping out of the Palestinians from history, wiping out the Palestinian narrative, by that hoping that you totally remove any Palestinian demands for national rights and collective rights. And this should be taken very, very seriously, because if the superpower of the world is involved in such an operation, in such a project, then the people who are at the receiving end of this project are facing an existential danger in many, many ways. So despite the stupidity that accompanies the basic assumption of this project, one should not underestimate its ability to affect in a very negative and destructive way the lives of people in Palestine and the life of the millions of Palestinians who became refugees after 1948. Now let me move to the possible developments in the post-Colonial, as I call it, era, and just say something about the connection between the coronavirus crisis and the issues we have discussed so far. Contrary to all our fears, and thank God for that, one of the most vulnerable places we thought would be affected by the coronavirus was supposed to be the Gaza Strip. But it seems that the hermetic siege and blockade on the Gaza Strip in an absurd way meant that the virus did not spread there in any dramatic way, and maybe one should also compliment the health authorities there for taking the right measure. I think the same is true about the West Bank, although the situation in East Jerusalem was a bit more complicated, where indeed not the Palestinians are in charge, but the Israelis. But all in all, so far the coronavirus has not turned into a human catastrophe in Palestinian areas, and that's good. However, under the guise of the coronavirus, the Israeli army has intensified its unilateral actions against the Palestinians, especially in the West Bank, again as part of this unilateral policy to try and take as much as they can from Area C and turn it into a Jewish area, believing that the coronavirus created a situation in which the world was distracted by the virus and therefore was less attentive to what Israel was doing on the ground. This is why we know that Israel returned to arrests of children, which it stopped for a while. Children are again being arrested in the West Bank. It accelerated the expropriation of land, the building of illegal housing estates on settlements, and other measures which are familiar to us, but this time are done in a more concentrated way, as if the Israelis say to themselves, we have a window of opportunity to accelerate the process of annexation, or one can call it the process of displacement and replacement. Now, what does the near future hold for us in this respect? Of course, one should look first of all at the American scene and ask oneself if a different American president would be elected, and we're not that far from the American elections in November 2020, if President Trump would be replaced by President Biden, would we see a dramatic change in American policy or softening of the assault on the Palestinian issue? Well, judging by what we know from the past, maybe again, if the rhetoric of a Democratic president would be a bit different from the rhetoric of a Republican president. There's no doubt about that. However, never an American administration undid what an American administration before it did. So there's no chance for any retreat from the harm that already had been done. But all in all, America would continue to be a dishonest broker, would basically accept the idea of economic peace and depoliticized Palestine, even if it would not say it loud and clear as the Trump administration declares it. So we have to be quite careful in pinning too many hopes of a dramatic change in American policy, because of the failure of Trump to deal properly with the virus crisis. He may lose the election, he may also not lose them. Now, Europe until now has made strong voices or voiced a strong criticism on some of the parts of the deal of the century, but again, history here repeats itself. We've been there before when Israel assaulted and massacred the people of Gaza since 2006 to 2014. The European condemnation was strong, was impressive, but was toothless. It had no impact on Israeli policies, nor did it really influence Israeli-European relationship in issues that matter. So in many ways, with or without Trump, and with and without Netanyahu, we can see a continuation of the same policy. The pace may change, the rhetoric may change, but the direction is the same direction. So what can be done, or where should we look for some silver lining in this very dark scenario? We need to go back in many ways to 2008 and look at various societies in the world in a situation where the gap between the political elites on the one hand and the civil societies on the other hand is widening. We are still in the same process. Never before, and the virus crisis only accentuated this, never before had political elites lost the confidence of people and electorates in them. And the Palestine issue is one of these symbolic issues which shows the hypocrisy, the double talk that accompanies the political discourse and the gap between what politicians supposedly are committed to in terms of universal values and their actual policy on the ground. And I think that it's not an incident that when indigenous people in North America demonstrate for the rights of Native Americans, when workers in Argentina demonstrate for the rights of better working conditions, or people who fight against any form of oppressions in many parts of the world, when they demonstrate or act, adorn themselves with the Palestinian flag. Because for them, this is the flag of injustice, or the flag for the struggle against injustice. Not because it's the worst atrocity, not because it's the worst injustice, it isn't. But it's the one that is not acknowledged and that is continuously denied. And therefore this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of exceptionalism makes it such an important case for so many people. So in many ways, whatever the American and Israeli policies are on the ground, the electorates or the civil society in the West, in the Muslim world, and we've seen it during the Arab Spring, in the Arab world is not accepting the logic behind these policies that support Israel unconditionally or without any serious criticism, do not accept that these policies should be void of any moral judgment, and I think as the years go by, also are not buying anymore into the formula that informed the peace process, like the two-state solution. I think there's a whole new generation of Palestinians and people who are involved in the solidarity movements around the Palestinians who see no reason not to support a solution that is totally based on humanitarian, on human values, civic values, and the right of self-determination, freedom, and liberation. And not surprisingly, this civil society sees the successful struggle against apartheid in South Africa as an inspirational model for how actually this could be done in the future. There are three conditions for the more optimistic scenario, the genuine deal of the century that has to confront the steal of the century. There are three, and with this I would finish. There are three kind of developments that one should look for and hopefully would happen, but of course this is beyond anyone's ability to predict. And in many ways they are not only parallel, they are also consecutive, namely one influences the other. It's very difficult to move into a contra deal or a counter deal without significant changes in the Palestinian national movement. The Palestinian national movement has not defined yet its concept of liberation for the 21st century. The bodies that represent the Palestinians, whether these are the Palestinian members of the Israeli Knesset, the PA, or any other body that is officially part of the Palestinian national movement, still adhere to the two-state solution, where there is a sense that the civil society and the public are moving away from that idea. And there is an absence of one voice, of a clear one voice that can direct everyone else. The solidarity movement with the Palestinians, the anti-Zionist groups in Israel, and whoever can help the Palestinians to deal with the imbalance of the century, that is Israel versus the Palestinians. So one would hope that unity from above, a clear vision for the future from below maybe, academics, activists, and so on, the very optimistic indication that this is that we are in the process of that happening, but this would have to happen for any chance of countering the steal of the century. The second development, to which I hinted before, but is already happening, is narrowing the gap between very clear ideas that people around the world have of what their governments should do about Palestine and the actual policies of these governments. If you look at different sections of the civil society in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, in the Muslim world, in countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, in the Arab world, you can see that that various sections such as academia, alternative media, women's organization, trade unions already established their own principles when it comes to Palestine. And according to these principles, they regard Israel as a pariah state, as a state that has to be boycotted, that has to be sanctioned by the government, that is not accepted as a member of the community of civilized nations. These positions are very clearly stated. Nobody is now hiding behind them. And even the Israeli attempt to silence these voices by accusing every such position as anti-Semitism, Israelis weaponizing the anti-Semitism in the struggle against this development, and especially against the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, the BDS movement, it's not working. It is not working because this is a genuine sense of justice that motivates especially the younger generation in the global society. Still, this energy has not transform the positions of politicians. And one of the reasons is that we have seen what happened when brave politicians such as Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, and Bernie Sanders, the candidate for the Democratic Party, dared to voice basic solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. They were destroyed by the Israeli lobbies, respectively, in the United Kingdom and the United States. So the message for young politicians is that if you genuinely speak about your support for the Palestine issue, you will be smeared and intimidated and condemned as an anti-Semite. And it will take a very brave young politician to sustain such a moral position. But we have representatives in the House of Representatives in America, the 3 brave women who already do it. So maybe there is the beginning of a change and the narrowing of the gap between the people wants the policy on Palestine to be and what the policy on Palestine would really be. That's the second one. And the last one I want to talk about, which is close to my heart because I am a Jew who was born in Haifa and I'm an Israeli citizen, is of course the big question that one should ask. Can there be a change within the Israeli Jewish society? Is it important at all to look for a change in the Israeli Jewish society? And I believe it is. But I think that the clear Palestinian vision and even stronger support in the world to the idea of the BDS and the idea of Israel as a pariah state, contrary to what people, some of them, our best friends, warned us, contrary to what they say, this would increase the number of people within the Jewish society who would be willing to consider courageously that there needs to be a regime change in Israel, and that there is a problem not just with the policies of the Netanyahu government, but there is an issue with the ideology of the state to which they belong. It's true that that ideology gives them privileges, it gives them power, and it's very difficult, we know from history, to convince people to give up privileges and to give up power. But I think some of them understand that with these privileges and with this power, security doesn't come. They feel still insecure. They are part of the Arab world, but they are aliens in the Arab world. And if they ever want to have normal life, they need to give up these privileges, and they have to reconcile to the fact that it would be a very painful process, similar to the one that the whites in South Africa had to undergo in order to build a new, just and peaceful society for the benefit of everyone. Now, I don't think this is something for the near future. I think it will take time for this to happen, but I think that there is a small subculture of young Israeli Jews who understand, at least, or begin to understand, that this is necessary in order to remove the injustice that is inbuilt into the Jewish state. You can see it in the growing numbers of young people who evade the military service or refuse openly to serve in the Israeli army. You can see it in the large number of young Israelis who leave the country, not just for economic reasons, but because they don't want to be part of such a society. I think some of it can be channeled into more proactive movement of change, and together they can play the same part that progressive white people played in the African National Congress movement that brought a change in South Africa. All these are possibilities. I'm not claiming that they are happening now, but I'm just trying to, and with this will be really my final sentences, I'm trying to say that the deal of the century is a policy from above. It's very difficult to see who from above, by this I mean political elites, the mainstream media, mainstream academia. It's very difficult to see who in that structure of politics from above will dare to bring an alternative deal. So I think the deal of the century would remain, or the logic of the deal of the century, would remain to be the logic of the so-called peace process, which anyway is dead, in the case of Israel and Palestine. The alternative is already there. It's already being conceived. It's already being constructed, but it's built from below. alternative media, by NGOs, by academics, by activists, by trade unions, by young people, mostly Palestinians, people with solidarity with the Palestinians and other groups. There is a network of identification between indigenous, native people, oppressed workers, oppressed people, with the Palestinians. This is a very powerful human impulse that can produce an alternative deal, but it needs to be done. It hasn't been done yet, and it has to be led by the Palestinians for the sake not only for the Palestinians, but for the sake of anyone who lives here, was expelled from here, and probably for the region as a whole. Thank you very much.